Good Shabbos again, everyone. It's amazing how life works sometimes. A few weeks ago on a Sunday evening, Lisa and I were out to dinner with one of our children, and we normally don't get dessert on Sunday nights. We've had enough dessert after Shabbat and Saturday night. But for whatever reason, as we were leaving dinner, I said, Lisa, let's go to one of my favorite places for dessert, the Ben & Jerry's over on Kirby. It's amazing how life works. I am so glad I went because I had no idea that that would be forever my last Ben & Jerry's. Because as many of you may know, the very next day, Ben & Jerry's would declare that it was inconsistent with our values for its products to be sold in what they termed as occupied Palestinian territory. Although the company did not specify what it believes to be occupied Palestinian territory, in context, this is presumed to include Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Old City, perhaps even our beloved Kotel, the Western Wall. Ben & Jerry's cited concern shared with us by our fans and trusted partners in its statement. Many have interpreted this as a reference to vehemently anti-Israel groups, such as Vermonters for a Just Peace in Palestine and the group Decolonize Burlington. I'm glad I enjoyed my last Ben & Jerry's, but I admit it's not going to be easy. I love their chocolate fudge brownie, the chocolate chip cookie dough, the cherry Garcia. Why couldn't the broccoli makers of America boycott Israel? In a separate statement, the Ben & Jerry's board of directors criticized their parent company, Unilever, for adding a commitment to stay in Israel to its original announcement. Some have pointed to a history of anti-Israel bias from the board's chairperson. She's also, you should know, the executive director of a nonprofit organization that has often promoted lies about Israel, accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing. My friends, there's no doubt that this decision was a strong anti-Israel statement of various members of Ben & Jerry's board of directors. But it's a free country and a free marketplace, and companies like these are free to sell their products wherever they wish. And I assume that the board of directors of Ben & Jerry's feel this decision will hurt Israel and help Palestinians. In fact, the original founders of Ben & Jerry's, Bennett Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, wrote an op-ed defending the decision. They wrote, "We believe business is among the most powerful entities in society. We believe that companies have a responsibility to use their power and influence to advance the wider common good." But my question is, does this boycott advance the wider common good? First, it's been estimated that 160 Arab and Jewish workers in Israel will lose their jobs when the contract for the Israeli Ben & Jerry's franchise expires next year. And Palestinian workers who are working for the distribution company will also lose their positions. Ben & Jerry's West Bank boycott won't punish leadership responsible for failed peace negotiations. Instead, it will rob a few hundred innocent people of their jobs, including Palestinians, who will not be able to receive comparable salaries and working conditions elsewhere. On the peace front, this boycott will only make Israelis more defensive, on guard, less likely to want to take actions for peace when they perceive that everyone, even ice cream companies, are against them. Boycotts only fuel the Palestinian anti-normalization efforts by seeking to cut off contact with Israelis. And finally, I would argue, most importantly, this boycott puts lives at risk. I understand that they want Israel out of the West Bank. In many ways, I sympathize with that. In an ideal world, I too would love to see Israel out of most of the West Bank and see two states, a Jewish one and a Palestinian one, living side by side in peace. But my colleague, Rabbi Danny Gordis, puts it perfectly. He wrote last week in response to this boycott, as young Jewish progressives on campus are living a post-campus life, busy protesting against American support for Israel, how exactly they would guarantee Israel's safety if Israel pulled out of the West Bank. How would they prevent Hamas from taking over the West Bank like they did in Gaza? And from these progressives, I often hear something like, "We're not policy people." Now imagine that any of these same progressives, who are the graduates often of America's finest universities, wrote a term paper advocating that taxes be abolished. And imagine then the professor calling them in the office and saying, "It's nicely written, and you make a compelling case about all that's wrong with the current tax system. But in abolishing taxes, how are you anticipating that the government can pay for things?" And then imagine that any of these students replying, "Well, I'm not a policy person." We can guess the grade the student would get. They would fail. They would fail the assignment because these young people are expected to learn to think. And when it comes to the end of the occupation, they're not thinking. They feel no responsibility to understand the results of what they are pushing, because they actually have no idea how to do without Israelis put directly in harm's way, without any idea how to guarantee that Israel's pulling out of certain territories would actually end the conflict. Because if Israel pulled out of the West Bank under current conditions, as they did in Gaza in 2005, Hamas would likely and quickly take over the West Bank. And ask those who live in southern Israeli communities how that's turned out for them. Because Hamas is committed to Israel's destruction, as we've seen over and over again. So how do we end the occupation? Through boycotts? That's the question millions of Israelis wish they could answer. But it becomes rather obvious that the board members of Ben & Jerry's jumped on the progressive bandwagon about so-called occupation without a clue as to what they were actually advocating, without a moment's thought as to what boycotts like these might mean for lives in Israel, both Jewish and Arab lives. Yes, my friends, I believe Ben & Jerry's was making a statement, but not making a real difference, a helpful and constructive difference. Or as my colleague Rabbi Morgan shared with me, I still don't get how stopping the sale of their ice cream in the West Bank actually helps Palestinians. It makes a statement, I suppose, but it doesn't seem to directly benefit the Palestinians. Boycotts are usually designed to economically hurt the company or the entity being boycotted. I don't see how this boycott does anything like that. I agree. In the future, I'll no longer enjoy Ben & Jerry's, not just because I can enjoy a Texas-made Bluebell instead, and not just because of the anti-Israel bias of its board. Most importantly of all, I'm tired of companies like Ben & Jerry's making statements without actually making a positive difference. Because companies like Ben & Jerry's are not alone. How often in this day and age do we hear from other companies, politicians, athletes, famous celebrities who make strong statements, and sometimes we may agree with what they have to say. On social media, let's be honest, we read them constantly. I support X, you must love Y, I believe in Z. But is it enough to make a statement without backing it up with positive actions that really contribute to building a brighter future for all? For example, on one extreme side of the political spectrum, how often do we hear strongly worded statements, defund the police? We heard that again from a very progressive member of Congress this week. Yes, of course, police departments are always looking to get better. They'll tell you they need more money for better training. But getting rid of the police is not something that will create a better society for anyone. Yes, defund the police is a perfect example of a statement that would not make a positive difference. Or on the other extreme, we still hear statements that the election was stolen. It's amazing. people still believed that the election was a lie. Big statements with no real facts to back it up. And of course, statements like these also do nothing to build a better future for all Americans. Perhaps like me, you too are tired of it. People, elected leaders, companies like Ben & Jerry's making false claims, pushing lies, or virtue signaling just to seem important and in the know. People with loud opinions trying to demonstrate their superior character, but in reality, they're just massaging their own egos. Instead, this Shabbat, I countered that we look for leaders who don't use words, but rather care about making a positive and genuine difference, who actually care about people from all walks of life, who are real leaders, not just people looking to get more likes or sell more ice cream. As the rabbis in their wisdom taught us long ago in the Pirkei Avot, Shammai used to say, Emor ma'at va'aseh harbeh. Speak little, but do much. Speak little, but do much. Shabbat Shalom. Now let us return to our prayer book as we rise for the Aleinu, page 54.